Welcome to Our People's Podcast. Today, I am going to be your host, Amanda, and with me, I have Wayla, and we are so honored to have Janice Selby with us today, an author and a podcaster and a YouTuber and a therapist. So, Janice, if you want to go ahead and tell us about yourself.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Sioux people in the Okanagan Valley, British Columbia, Canada. And I was raised in a city called Kelowna, and my parents were Pentecostal. And so that means speaking in tongues. And I remember them anointing my head with oil when I was sick. They loved me, they cared about me. And uh, church was oftentimes quite a happy, exciting place to be, lots of great music and this sort of thing. There was always a dark side as well. Of course, being the fear of hell. And, I learned about hell as a child and I believed that it existed. My parents believed the Bible was literal and inerrant and completely true. Um, so even though my mother, who's a very loving and kind person, presented Jesus and the Bible as a very loving situation. My father was pardon me, a narcissist and a fundamentalist. And so he brought the hell into things. And because he was a narcissist and a fundamentalist, rules were very important in our family. My dad was quite volatile emotionally. And so I felt safer with rules because if I knew the rules, then I had a better chance of not, you know, incurring his anger. And so even my friends all saw me as a real rule follower. And in fact, they gave me a nickname in elementary school. It was called the Constable, because they saw that I was always trying to do everything right. And I went to public school with my siblings for most of my schooling because private school was too expensive. And then in my junior high years, I really became even more enamored of Christianity. And I started attending a church different from my parents, but it was even more the Pentecostal flavor. And I loved it there. I loved going. It wasn't just, on Sunday morning. It was Sunday morning, Sunday night, and then, choir and drama and youth group and all these things. So that was really where I felt at home. Uh, but unfortunately, it wasn't grounded in reality because, of course, religion, um, at least the beliefs I had, were thoroughly um, magical beliefs. They weren't reality beliefs, reality-based beliefs. But nobody was telling me that. And so I just really went with it and I was very wholehearted and all in. And then I met a man who was quite intelligent and who was tall. Those were important to me. And even most important, he was a born again Christian believer. And our pastor set us up, and sure enough, it worked. And we, felt some sparks flying. And so, boy, oh boy, we better not put off getting married for too long because it's better to marry than to burn with passion, as they say. And so we got married. And then he wanted to go to Bible college, so we had a couple kids. They were just little at the time, and off we went to Three Hills, Alberta, to Prairie Bible Institute. And while we were there, when I would go into the small shopping store in the town where you could get your groceries, I would see these women, and they were always dressed so modestly, and they always had their hair up in a bun, pardon me, under a little covering, a little black covering. And I said to my husband at the time, I didn't know we had Amish people here. And he said, no, they're not Amish. They're a type of Mennonite, and they're actually being obedient to scripture. And I said, they are? And he said, yeah. And there was never anything dismissing women from dressing that way. But my husband he wasn't a pushy person. He wouldn't have pushed that type of thing on me. But boy, oh boy, when I found out there were more rules and I was missing out on the rules. I ran back home. I got out the Greek lexicon and the concordance and all the things that I would need to properly understand the Bible. And sure enough, I saw in the New Testament, Paul was telling us how we're to dress and look and behave. And boy, oh boy, I just took that right to heart. I took it so seriously. I had to repent right there that I had not been adequately obedient. And I asked my husband, of course, because I needed his permission, would he be okay if I started wearing a head covering? And he said if I really felt like it was something that I needed to do, he wouldn't fuss about it, but he didn't ever want me to think that I needed to do it. Now, what I haven't mentioned was that I didn't find that marriage particularly easy. My ex-husband and I, um, we didn't really mesh in a lot of ways, and we didn't have many things in common other than we were both Jesus followers. So I found it kind of a difficult situation. Um, and I figured since he was my God-given head, okay, I got my air quotes going there, that the problem couldn't be him. It must have been me. So when I thought of wearing this head covering would be a visible reminder to me to shut my pie hole, to quit having all these ideas or ever trying to correct them or anything like that, that I needed to learn to submit. And this piece of cloth on my head was going to remind me, and I was going to be a whole different wife, boy, from that time on. So I didn't know how to sew, but I did have a glue gun and some fabric. And so I used my glue gun and I made my head covering. I glued some fabric onto a headband. And didn't I feel righteous and holy? My oh my, I certainly did. And along with that, I got rid of all my pants and just I would only wear long skirts and dresses from that time on, which I would, of course, get from the thrift store. So the people that knew me at the Bible college went from seeing me as relatively normal to suddenly looking quite a bit different. Uh, but I would only talk to people about it if they asked or they were interested. I didn't want to go around telling other women, you need to be doing this or you should do this, because I really felt that it was something a person would maybe have to feel motivated in their own heart to do it, because that's the only way it wouldn't be a show. And so then the Mennonite ladies in town, they were Holdeman Mennonites, they started getting up their courage to talk to me because they hadn't seen another woman covering outside of their group. And they were very polite and respectful in approaching me, very kind, actually. And so my husband and I and our two little girls started attending that Holdeman church. And even though I didn't have a clue how to sew, we would, go to sewing circle and these sorts of things, and they would have us over for dinner. And I really started studying the Bible with them. And they didn't have any instruments, and my ex-husband and I were both musicians, and so that I think he found a little bit hard to take. I thought it was beautiful. Um, I did notice, there were some real differences I felt between me and the other ladies, and I felt like, boy, they submission and meekness must really come more easily for them because they just seemed, like I said, submissive and meek and really just focused on their family and so forth. Um, but it still felt like a real struggle for me. And sometimes I would make jokes, and let me tell you, those jokes fell flat. They did not go over very well. If I was at Bible study, I remember one time that someone was talking about the sins of omission and sins of commission. I said, "Oh, except for smoking, that's a sin of emission." And nobody laughed. Just thought it's really funny. Why are you people laughing? But anyway, I digress. So I was really trying to mold myself into the image of these women that I felt were so godly, and my husband had already been growing a beard, and so that was great. Um, and one time we went there after we'd been hanging out with them for a year or so, and it was a service where they were doing foot washing. And that was so beautiful to me. And I just remember crying, and I wasn't allowed to participate because I wasn't actually a member of the congregation, and that made me so sad. I really felt like yeah, I just felt very sad. I felt like that was a distinction that I wished they wouldn't make because I did with all my heart want to participate. But eventually we left the Bible college. My husband got a job pastoring in Saskatchewan in an even smaller community. And I was still wearing my head covering, and this was at a Pentecostal church. And after a while, my husband said to me, I want you to stop covering because that covering is making a division between you and the other women in the congregation. Oh gosh, I was just so heartbroken because I really felt like I was being obedient to scripture and being a good example for my daughters and this sort of thing. Oh, of course, my daughters, they all they could wear were skirts and dresses, and I never cut their hair either, these sorts of things. But so then here we are pastoring in a small community in Saskatchewan, and I'm not supposed to cover anymore. Uh, and I was trying to get us involved in the town as much as I could. It's very hard to get involved in a small town when you're an outsider. So I started doing some writing for the newspaper and, helping out, doing other things in the town. And eventually I thought, well, this town needs a coffee shop. I'm going to see maybe I can open a coffee shop. Um, and my husband was very unhappy there. Church was dying, and he saw his job as to rejuvenate the church. We didn't want the church to die on our watch, so he was trying to implement all these changes really fast. And it was an elderly congregation. They weren't interested in changes. They certainly weren't interested in changes, so fast and furious. And so I would be the intermediary. They would come and complain to me, uh, and then I would have to go to him and talk to him about it. And he had some interesting personality quirks as well that made him maybe not quite as receptive to a lot of things, or he maybe wouldn't see a lot of things emotionally or understand them that other people would. So I really felt like I was in the middle. It was very difficult. And eventually, he told me to forget all my plans of a coffee shop in this town or anything else because we weren't going to stay. We were going to leave. Uh, and I wasn't sad for us to go because it had been a miserable, very difficult year. And actually, so that year, he felt it was good for him because he loved to work on his sermons. And boy, he was so raring to go. Every Monday, he'd get to the church and he'd lock himself in the church in the office and work on his sermons and work on his guitar, his electric guitar, and this sort of thing. Problem was, the congregation wanted to have access to the church and to my husband, and they'd show up at the church and the church would be locked, and the church was never locked. So then they're phoning me and I'm phoning him and he's not answering. So eventually I'm outside the window of his office throwing rocks at his window trying to get his attention to, you got people to get it. So anyway, um, eventually, he got frustrated with them and he wanted to leave the town. But the other things that had happened, it made it a very difficult year for me because I felt like I was constantly putting out these emotional fires and social fires that he was totally unaware of. Uh, and then I felt like, there was a distance between me and God because I wasn't able anymore to wear my precious head covering. And also, my parents split up after about 40 years together at that time. That was huge. That was big. And then uh, a family member contacted me and told me that my youngest nephew had killed somebody and he was on the run, and the police were a little nervous that he might try and come and hide out with us in Saskatchewan. So I had to be ready if he showed up to contact the police. It was a lot of stress and strain. And so eventually my husband said, no, we've had enough. We're leaving. And so we left. And, surprise, surprise, the marriage did not get better. Things kept unraveling. Eventually, we ended up back in the town where I grew up in Kelowna, where my family was. And then, unfortunately, our youngest daughter received a life-threatening and lifelong diagnosis. And for me, on top of all the other things. And there's so many more things that I just haven't even talked about, things that went wrong, things that were really, really difficult in that time. Her diagnosis just really put me over the edge. I thought, I don't know anyone else who's tried as hard to be obedient to scripture as I have. And then everything was just going wrong. It was like we were being punished. And so, of course, Christian friends are, well, is there sin in your life? Or God's just chastising you, or, pray more. Have you tried fasting? All these things. Of course, I tried all those things. And then one night, I heard my little girl, the one who'd been diagnosed, I heard her praying to God, and she asked God uh, to forgive her whatever sin she had done that was making her so sick. And that just broke my heart. And I thought, that is not a God. That's a monster. That's a beast that would afflict a child. Um, and so in that moment, I gave myself permission to start looking elsewhere. I thought, I've bet on the wrong horse. There may be a God somewhere, but I don't think he's in Christianity. It's got to be out there somewhere else. And I didn't feel that I could share with my husband what I was going through. We were already having so much trouble, just kind of hanging on by a thread. And so I got up my courage, and there was a bookstore across the street from us. One day I went over there after the kids were in school because I had stopped homeschooling when we moved, put them in school, Christian school, of course. And my husband was at work. And I knew in this little bookstore they had a section. You had to open a curtain, a dark curtain to go back there. And over top of the door, it said occult and I don't know, Eastern philosophies or other stuff, Eastern religions. And I sucked in a big breath and I pulled open that curtain. I went back there. I thought, I'm going to find it. God's going to be in here somewhere. He's going to be in one of these books. And my heart was just pounding. And so I found a book, and it was comparing Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism and one other thing. It was comparing and contrasting. And I thought, okay, this looks enough like a textbook that if anybody caught me with it, I'd be okay. So I took it up to the counter and I actually asked if they had a brown paper bag. I was that nervous about looking elsewhere, even though I was giving myself permission. I was still so scared. And I took that book and I put it in the safest place I could imagine, my underwear drawer, because I thought even God wouldn't look in my underwear drawer. And then it laid there for a while, and eventually I took it out and started reading it, and it was making some sense. And I went back to the bookstore and started getting other books by people who weren't Christian people, and started getting a little more comfortable with this, and really started dabbling in new age type stuff and Eastern philosophies and chakras and all these things. Like eventually it was so exciting. These things that had been forbidden once, now I could actually enjoy them. Like I went to an astrologer and I went to a psychic and I did all these things and I felt so like open-minded, and boy oh boy, imagine, how far I've come. Um my poor kids must have had freaking whiplash because watch mom go from being wound up so tight to all of a sudden like, oh, there's no rules. We're getting tattoos. We're doing all these things. Uh, I'm sure it was challenging for them. And I did talk with them about it along the way and asked them what they thought and, whether they believed Bible. And I was very shocked when my kids were like, no, I never did believe that. I'm like, what? How could you not believe? Because I had done my best to indoctrinate them. But uh, so anyway, things were still hanging on in my marriage. But of course, we stopped attending church. I did try once or twice more to go after that, but it was like sawdust in my mouth singing those songs about a loving God. And when I knew that my child was suffering and in danger, um, yeah, it was really hard. And I felt entirely let down by the congregation, the church body. I had tried to just befriend so many people and really be there for them. And then I felt in my hour of need, they weren't especially forthcoming. And part of it might be that when Christian people see that we are no longer believing, there's kind of a fear that they might catch that. They think that apostasy might be contagious and they don't want to catch it. So they're not wanting to poke or pull on the thread, and have their life unravel. Because that's what was happening. So at any rate, yeah, so I wasn't believing anymore. Eventually the marriage did come to an end, and it was really hard and painful. And we'd been together about 18 years, I think, when we finally decided to call it quits. Um, but we still cared about each other. And I'm really glad of that fact because it has allowed us to retain quite a deep friendship with each other. So now we've been divorced for many years, but we're still very good friends. And whenever he's in town, he comes over. My new husband and I love to have him over for a meal and have the kids over. And it's worked out very well. I'm quite grateful for that. But at the time, it was hard. And I felt like I completely became unmoored. I didn't, my identity dissolved. I was no longer a homeschool wife and mother, anti-feminist, all these different things that had been, a Christian, of course, had been my main identity. And so those dissolved around me. My identity, my community, I lost, and my entire worldview resolved around me. So your worldview kind of provides the frame, the hooks on the wall where you're going to hang things. Suddenly there was nothing. Nothing made sense. Everything felt topsy-turvy. Things that I had believed with all my heart. I was learning from reading and watching videos and listening to podcasts and stuff that uh, they just weren't true. It was myth, and that there have been, as long as there have been people, there's been mythology, people making up stories to explain things, and that a lot of what I believe as a Christian, as a devout Christian, was simply recycled mythology. It had been around in earlier versions that far predated Christianity, even the idea of a virgin birth and a murdered and resurrected Savior. And when I learned that, I was just gobsmacked. I couldn't, that was so shocking to me because I believed it with all my heart. My parents believed it. Most of the people I had known my whole life really believed it. So watching Joseph Campbell, The Power of Myth, that's a book that Joseph Campbell wrote. And then he did a video series um, with Bill Moyers back in the early 90s. That was a video series that was really helpful for me. So I want to recommend that to anyone who wants to learn more about this idea of mythology. So yeah, everything kind of dissolved around me and it was a freaky time. I didn't know where to how to base things, how to live my life. I knew I didn't want to hurt people, like I never have wanted to hurt people. So that was kind of the only value then that I took with me. But as far as anything else, I decided I would deny myself nothing. And boy, I did a good job. I did not deny myself anything. I had some really interesting relationships that would have been off limits to me before, and allowed myself to try different, I don't know how to say it other than party favors. Like I tried different drugs and things like that. Nothing like terrible. I wasn't injecting drugs. I wasn't doing anything like that. But I was interested in expanding my mind with psychedelics and some of those things. And, I was drinking an awful lot. Um, so my life looked different. I looked different. It was a lot of changes in a fairly short amount of time. And I still was never able to find anyone else who had been as devout as me and who had left and was living a successful, happy, meaningful life. And it was a search. Like I didn't even know what to put in the computer. And of course, this was like the internet was still relatively new when this was going on, but I didn't know what to type even to find out to talk about what I was going through. But eventually, I must have typed in some kind of right thing because a video interview came up with an American psychologist who's now a dear friend of mine, Dr. Marlene Winnell. And Dr. Winnell was being interviewed on a news show because a young person had killed somebody, and the young person blamed it on their fundamentalist beliefs and being homeschooled and whatever else they and Dr. Winnell was on there talking about something I'd never heard of before called religious trauma syndrome. And that is a name for the collection of symptoms that we have when we are raised in authoritarian high demand religious group, or some will say cult, because, we suffer a lot of losses when we're members of that group. We are very restricted. And then we leave that group and we suffer more profound losses. So we can have symptoms, and that's the symptoms she calls religious trauma syndrome. So it might be something like uh, poor sleep, or nightmares, or overeating, undereating, poor relationship skills. I had huge gaps in my basic knowledge of um, things like science and sex, and even things like who's a movie star, or what any kind of music, secular music that happened in the early 2000s or anything like that. Just big gaps there. So those are all things that would fall in with religious trauma syndrome. So as I mentioned, I divorced my husband. I divorced my religion. I went back to school to become a registered professional counselor. And that's when I started recognizing my own trauma. I knew I had some type of PTSD from growing up with a very volatile, emotionally immature parent. And sure enough, I learned, oh, that's more likely complex PTSD. And then I started learning about religious trauma, as I mentioned, with Dr. Winnell talking about that. And I saw so many crossovers. Apparently, uh, adult children of alcoholics, we call that, ACOA, they also have a list of symptoms. They call it a laundry list. And so do we who grew up in religious homes. And I call my tribe acorns, adult children of religious nuts. And we share a laundry list with the ACOA folks. And that was really interesting for me to see and to recognize, of course, right near the top of that list, codependency, codependent traits, poor boundaries. And so it's hard to tease these apart, what's family of origin related trauma and what's religious trauma when religion was part of the family of origin. So I found all that stuff just incredibly interesting. And I connected right away with Dr. Winnell, and I was able to attend some of her retreats in San Francisco. Of course, I was terrified the first time I went. I was like, "Oh my God, what if it's a cult? No one's ever gonna find me again." I had all my horror stories there, and of course, none of that happened. It was just wonderful to attend and connect in person with other people from around the world who, like me, had believed devoutly and then no longer believed. And I mean, we're all there crying and holding each other, just so thankful that okay, we found each other, and we're all doing okay. We're doing okay, and Dr. Winnell obviously was doing, just fine. So her book is called Leaving the Fold, a guide for former fundamentalists and others leaving their religion. And that's a wonderful, wonderful book. It was very helpful for me. And so around the time I attended my first retreat with Dr. Winnell, there was a filmmaker from Sweden who had reached out to Dr. Winnell, was very interested in this idea because Sweden is by and large an irreligious, atheist country. And this person was really interested in, like, how do people get sucked into religion in the first place and all this stuff. So we all signed waivers at the retreats that this film crew could film while we were there, because of course you're sharing some intimate things. But we all agreed, and they came back a few more times, the filmmakers, and interviewed us through the years. And then last year, we received an invitation to go to Stockholm, Sweden, because they were finally premiering the documentary, which is called Leaving Jesus. And so my new husband, whom I actually met through Dr. Winnell, he was also recovering from religious trauma. He featured quite prominently in the documentary, and so we flew over and we got to attend the premiere in different theaters across Stockholm, and then we stayed for question and answer time afterwards, and it was a real honor. And we're looking forward to Leaving Jesus being released here in Canada and in the United States. And then I decided a few years ago it was also time for me to think about telling my story. So I did start a podcast. It's called the Divorcing Religion Podcast. Started some conferences CORT, the Conference on Religious Trauma. I've hosted that many times online. And then another conference I started because I realized that so many of my clients who have left religion have a lot of issues around sex and sexuality, a lot of problems there, and we call that purity culture indoctrination. So I decided we needed a conference called Shameless Sexuality, Life After Purity Culture. And so that's another one of the conferences that I started. And in fact, this year, 2025, in May, I'll be hosting that in person in Seattle, Washington. It's the first time I've ever hosted an in person event. And I'm a little nervous because now it looks like a lot of very right-wing religious people are throwing their weight around in the United States, and they are very much in line with purity culture. They don't want people learning about sex and pleasure. So it'll be interesting to see how my conference goes over there in May. But I encourage people to go to shamelesssexuality.org and check it out. So I started those conferences, and I started a YouTube channel because I wanted people to be able to watch my podcast and my conferences. And then I thought it's time to write a book. So, of course, what am I going to do? I'm going to write a book. So I wrote my book called Divorcing Religion, a memoir and survival handbook. And that was just published in December of 2024. It went to number one in 7 Amazon spots. There's definitely a hunger for people to read and learn about other people who were indoctrinated, who managed to leave their group and are going on to live happy and successful lives. And the second half of the book, Survival Handbook, is based on a workshop that I developed called the Divorcing Religion Workshop. And I made it so that it kind of mirrors the stages of marital divorce because I really felt losing my faith. It felt like a divorce. It felt like I was torn in two. It was really, really very difficult. You know, some people aren't even able to survive such a loss. That's how hard it can hit them, and particularly if they don't have support on the other side of it. So now, as a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach, I am a support person for people. I have clients from all around the world, from every religious background and cult that you can imagine, who are just, they need someone to talk to. They're looking for help. What are my next steps? How can I build a safe and supportive secular community for myself? Sometimes I work with people who have to flee the country that they're living in because they're not safe there. If people find out they don't believe the same as their families, their lives are in danger. And that is just a whole additional level of terror that most of us aren't even familiar with. So yeah, that's the work that I do now. And my website is divorcingreligion.com. And that's kind of my life in a nutshell. I remarried a couple years ago. Very, very happy in my new partnership. My book is out. I'm quite close to my children, close to their dad. I have a lovely relationship with my mom. My siblings also left. My mom's the only one that's still holding the torch there for good old Jesus, but she's in her middle 80s, and I don't want her to have a crisis of faith at this point in her life. So she knows the work that I do, and she just treads lightly around it. She says she wants to support me. She's proud of me. I told her I didn't want her to read my book, that I didn't think it would bless her. And she said, Dear, my daughter wrote a best-selling book, and I want to have that book on my shelf. So I said, okay, all right, you've been warned. I probably should have ripped out chapter whatever so she wouldn't read it, but she just was thankful for it. And so I really am so fortunate in how things have turned out for me. That's it.
Yes. I read your book. Like I said, I finished it last night, and you went through it. You went through a lot of things. You didn't mention the weird landlord that you guys packed up and moved without him knowing it.
Oh my gosh, no, I'm gonna leave some stuff in the book. Yeah, it was a challenge. I gotta say that marriage, that first marriage really was a challenge. And my ex-husband's very good person, very kind person, but it wasn't an easy union. Like I say, there was lots of stuff that happened, and we wouldn't have met or married if it hadn't been for the religious beliefs that we had. And a lot of times I work with folks who are struggling to keep their marriage together because one of them no longer believes, or it can happen the other way. They marry with no beliefs, and then one gets converted. It's caught up in a cult or a conspiracy group or a religion, whatever. Um, and that's really tough when that happens. So, yep, it's been a lot.
So, I did notice in reading your story, you know, a lot of similarities of what I have, experienced myself or watched some of my friends go through and things like that. So, like you said, that there are a lot of similarities with that whole that we share with somebody of like alcoholic parents and things like that. Like we lose a lot. It's a grief that we have to go through and we have to mourn. And it is made difficult because there's not, per se, a dead body, but there are dead
Mhm.
relationships all over the place.
Yeah,
So
there are different types of grief that we suffer, including ambiguous loss, where there is no body to bury. And so, even say I have a cat and I had to put my cat down or something, and I tell my boss, and the boss is like, "Wow, okay, take the afternoon off, and we'll just see you on Monday or whatever." I go into that same boss and say, I don't believe in God anymore. They're just like, well, good. You stopped believing in Santa Claus. Now get back to your desk. And it's can be really invalidating when people do not understand the depth. That rocks you to your core. It's almost like finding out you were adopted and you're an adult and your whole life has been based on this one thing. And then it's like, oh my God, what else am I believing that is not true? Like we lose trust in ourselves as well is one of the issues. So I do happen to think that all counseling is grief counseling of one thing or another. Typically, we enlist the help of a therapist because we're having trouble coming to terms with a change. Even sometimes it might have been a change that we anticipated. We knew it was coming. Maybe we were even going to celebrate it, but there's always loss. There's loss and there are gains. They kind of go together. It's really helpful to work with a secular therapist if you're recovering from religious trauma. And there is a program in the United States, the Secular Therapy Project, and it was started by Dr. Daryl Ray, who's another close friend of mine, and he runs recoveringfromreligion.org. And Dr. Winnell's is called journeyfree.org. And mine, of course, is Divorcing Religion.
um I actually took Dr. Daryl's course.
Oh, you did?
I'm
Nice.
literally one video away from finishing it up. Okay.
Wow. Dr. Daryl Ray.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah, he's just great. I was just chatting with him yesterday. And now that I do this work, I'm connected to other people in the atheist community. Some of your listeners might be familiar with my friend Seth Andrews. His show is called The Thinking Atheist. He texted me just the other day. He says, "Look, we got to get you back on to talk about your book." And these are people I would have prayed for or against when I'm very religious. And they are just the kindest people, really wanting to support and help other people who are recovering from religious trauma. We understand the pain and the loss.
Seth Andrews was a big one for me as well. I found him, I think he was about at 375 of his podcasts, and I listened all the way back to number one.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah,
he's great. He's so kind. Like he is a
yeah.
kind and gentle person. So a lot of the folks out there can be quite they can just be really unkind and just very direct, and it's okay to be a direct, but I don't want to be mocking people who believe things because I believed those things as well. And I know what it's like to fear losing that belief system. I really think compassion is a great way to go. And I do think that Seth is quite a compassionate person for sure.
Yeah, I think he changed my whole view on atheism because when when I left the church, I was looking for truth, and then my whole belief system fell apart, and so I started looking, and I found Seth Andrews, and him talking to his callers was what changed my thinking on what an atheist was.
Wow.
Wait, him
What
talking
and
to
so
what?
His callers, he at the end of his shows, he would have people call in and he would talk,
Mhm.
and he always treated them with respect and kindness.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, I'll be sure and tell him that that I was able to connect with someone else in whose life he made a difference. Because what a beautiful thing. I mean, at the end, that's all that's really left. It's like you throw a pebble in the pond and it ripples and ripples and ripples. And what am I doing with my life? Because I no longer believe in an afterlife fantasy, the one that I had when I was religious, or even then I believed for a long time in reincarnation. And people have all sorts of different beliefs, but for me, what I've landed on at this point is that probably this will be it. I can't say for sure, and actually nobody can say for sure, but I think probably this will be it. And so, what am I doing? What will I leave behind? What will people remember? uh, of me. So, and in that book, the book that I wrote, Divorcing Religion, boy, oh boy, I don't paint myself in a beautiful light in that book. I really tell the truth about some of the choices that I kind of wish I didn't make. I wish I would have done things differently because I never wanted to hurt my family. And they did end up getting hurt. It's like pushing a beach ball underwater. You push it under and the pressure grows and grows. You take your hands off and the ball comes up and there's water splashing everywhere. It's messy. And my deconversion was messy. And so some people that I love were hurt by the things that I did. So that's another reason that the book is out there. I would like people to learn from my mistakes. And that's part of why I did the handbook as well, just encouraging people. It's good to explore, and you can still explore safely. You can still have some bumper guards there for you so you don't go completely off the rails like I did.
See, okay, that was another point that I wanted to bring up is you mentioned in your interview, that like there was no denying self, that you just kind of went and you learned and you talk a lot more about that in your book. And that is something else that commonly I have seen. People there have been so many boundaries that they just and the thing is that we were told everything was wrong, not how to do it in a constructive way or why maybe you don't want to do it or this or that or whatever. It was just wrong because the church said so. Well, at that point, you don't know why you believe what you believe, or you have, so really that moral compass is not there. And so I hate to tell anybody that's still in that religion, you learn that moral compass once you get out of those bounds of somebody else's rules. Then you can become um self-governing, and you can find what are your beliefs.
Yeah, so true, so true. And one thing that I work with most of my clients on fairly early on in the process is doing some form of values clarification, because the values that we have when we grow up in a religious home are the values that our parents, our religious leaders, their holy book, whatever it is, those are the things we're told those must be the most important to us. It's really important once we're out from under all that pressure and intensity for us to do some self-evaluation and think, what is actually important to me? So previously, obedience and submission would have been up at the top for me. Oh, they do not make my list now. The first one is autonomy. I have to be completely in charge of myself and making my own decisions. Sometimes that means I'm going to make the wrong decision, and that's just part of life. Sometimes we do make decisions that we wish we had done differently. we can only move forward. There's no going back.
You know, absolutely. And what's so interesting is that like my sister, she was in it for, I mean, our whole lives until 3 years ago. And so if I'll bring up, and I've been out 21 years, something like that, 22. And I'll bring up, well, you said this, or this is how you did that back then. And she's like, I was a different person. She's like, I believe what you're saying. She says, but like, I was a different person. And that's the truth. Like you can't hold anything against them, or like I don't hold anything against her because she's not that person anymore. And she has
Right.
opened her mind up to autonomy and people being individuals and seeing things differently.
Right. Yeah, I call it being under the influence. And we don't expect people to be making sane or rational decisions when they're under the influence. And religion is like a drug for a lot of people. And this is one reason why 12-step programs like to set up in churches, of course, and then people end up swapping their addiction from a substance to God or to prayer. They can end up then with scrupulosity, which is a religious form of OCD. Maybe they feel they have to say the sinner's prayer 500 times in a day, or things like that. It can really mess with people's minds for sure. But yeah, that's being under the influence. And when we're able to break free from that influence, we see things differently. Now I look at some of the things that I thought made total sense. Of course, there was a talking snake. Of course, there was a talking donkey. Of course, there was a floating zoo. Because God, because miracles, that was always the excuse. Well, God can do anything, or we just don't understand the mind of God. Um, but I don't think that way anymore.
Um,
Wasn't there a study that showed that, or are you aware of it, that addiction highlights a very similar part of the brain as religious experiences?
Right. Yeah. It can really kind of set off the reward center
Hmm.
of the brain. What I found interesting was a test like back in the 90s or whatever. Uh, they made a helmet, and the helmet had all these things you would attach to your head. And when the scientists would stimulate certain parts of the head, people would have this experience that someone was in the helmet with them, like that God was in there. And they called it the God helmet. And I actually found out about that. I read about that when we were at Bible college, and I read the article to my husband at the time. I said, well, what do you think about that? And he said, well, I think you better get rid of that magazine and we just won't think about this. Of course, by then we were thousands and thousands of dollars in debt for the Bible college. But yeah, there's people. That's what we are. I don't particularly subscribe to, I'm a naturalist. I don't really believe in anything supernatural. I know a lot of people still do, even when they leave religion, and people are allowed to believe what they believe. People crave certainty, security, order, and acceptance. That's basic to all of us. And it's unfortunate because that means we can be hijacked. That's what religions and conspiracy theories and cults tie up in a shiny ribbon. They offer us all of those things: certainty, security, order, and acceptance.
So another point that I wanted to just mention is I'm not sure how you brought it up, but the poor relationship skills. I think you referred back to your book, and that you had, yes, that is a very, very common thread I see is that we coming out of controlled religions have poor relationship skills. We do not know how to react appropriately to the world around us.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. We are ill prepared, and partly because curiosity is stamped out of us. It has to be replaced with obedience the first time, every time. And you can't be a really good religious person and be super curious, because that curiosity is going to lead you out of the religious belief system. So we're not allowed to be curious. We have to be obedient, and we, especially, I'm going to say for women, but also for men, but even more so for those of us assigned female at birth, our place is to serve. That's what it is. And get these uppity ideas out of your head that you're going to be doing anything else. You're here to serve, and you better do it joyfully. So that leads us into that makes us easy pickings, just ripe prey for narcissistic predators. Boy, oh boy, they go together hand in glove. And that's my parents. Dad is a narcissist. Mom, beautiful, kind, overly sweet. Mom is codependent. So and I went through several relationships after my first marriage ended, and I kept ending up with, ended up with a narcissist, ended up with a sociopath. That wasn't too much fun. And then finally got my shit together. Pardon me, got myself together and recognized where this shortcoming was in myself. It was a total blind spot. So I had to have it painfully exposed to me. And then I chose differently next time around.
I would have a question then. It
Hmm.
seems like, okay, in the course of my therapy, since I have left, a therapist has commented on the amount of narcissistic tendencies in the people that have been in my life.
Hmm.
In your experience, do you think that a lot of religions produce narcissistic type people?
Think in males that could certainly be, I mean, they're trained to believe that they're just one step below God,
Right.
and that women are to serve them, and that their children are to serve them, and no one better question. Boy, oh boy, that works out pretty nicely for the man who's
Yeah.
in charge. So I think that's definitely part of it. Even if a boy didn't have, natural tendencies that way, if that's what's modeled for them and that's what's preached to them, they are to be in charge. And then, of course, there are some things like autism spectrum disorder. There can be crossovers. There can be behaviors sometimes with some folks who are neurodivergent, and we used to call it Asperger's syndrome. And those behaviors can look like narcissism, but they're not necessarily. There really is a difference there in how the brain is functioning. But either way, to be in a healthy relationship, we have to have boundaries. We have to be able to voice those boundaries. We have to learn about consent. This is another problem, and with codependency and boundaries. When did you ever learn about consent when you were growing up? You didn't. You knew that your place was to obey. You had to obey your older siblings, your parents, your teacher, your pastor. Your place wasn't to question. It was to obey. And that brings me to the F word. No, I don't mean fat or fitness. I actually mean forgiveness. Forgiveness is the F word for a lot of my clients because it was demanded of them, and because it's so easily weaponized. The concept of forgiveness can be weaponized by abusers. So they will just have permission to keep doing the same thing over and over because the victim is forced to forgive. And it really actually drives me crazy because you don't need to forgive. What we do need is to get to a place of accepting reality. Okay, this person actually did do this very painful, terrible thing to me. This really did happen. And now I get to choose how to move forward. Do I want to keep this person in my life? Am I safe to keep this person in my life and grant them continued access to me? Should I go to the police? Do I want to go to the police and press charges? We have options. It's possible to recognize that someone is toxic and cut them off. Still go on to live quite a happy and successful life. You're just down, one toxic person. It's not like you're going to wind up in the gutter because you failed to forgive. There's the whole thing about God won't forgive if you don't forgive others. It's BS in my technical career opinion.
Okay, But I'd like to bring up a point. You put that mainly on males being narcissistic, but we see quite a bit of females with those same tendencies in our old religion.
Oh, yeah, very, very interesting. And so I wonder if that has to do with being the women are in a position of elder authority over younger women. And so they maybe would expect the younger women are going to be looking to them, and somebody has to be providing an example. I don't know. Sometimes some people just are narcissistic, whether they are in a religion or not. And it can also be maybe if they're married to someone who's in some kind of position of authority or elevation in the community, that can also be an issue. But the answer is boundaries, appropriate boundaries, and enforcing those boundaries. A boundary that you set but don't enforce isn't a boundary. It's just some words. So we have to be prepared to act on our boundaries. And you can enforce a boundary and not be a jerk about it. It's possible, but when we've been suppressed for so long, we can hold things in until all that comes out is anger and rage and all this kind of stuff. But it's very possible and necessary to learn to communicate before things get to that point. And there's nothing wrong with protecting yourself. And that's what boundaries are good for relationships. Not having boundaries is bad for any relationship, no matter who it's with. So it's just part of being human. And I love teaching folks about communication, effective communication, because I feel like that's really missing when we grow up in these fundamentalist homes.
Yes, it is. In fact, I just actually started therapy to learn how to communicate better.
Yay! Good for you. Yeah, I encourage any of your listeners really to consider getting therapy because it's really hard on us when we find out that things that we were taught aren't true, and then we do lose relationships, and there's so much grief there. So working with a professional, I highly recommend.
I had one more thing I was wondering if you'd want to elaborate on a little bit.
Sure.
The reason I ask this is because the Holdeman Church has this thing that they tell everybody that when someone leaves the Holdeman Church, they just fly off the handle, they just lose all direction. And you described that in your life. Um, could you elaborate a little bit on what you know of how somebody falls apart after their beliefs disappear?
Yeah, and I don't my time with the Holdemans was limited. It was like a few years. But
Well,
my
I'm
time growing up was in a religious home, so there was fundamentalism there. And yeah, just the feeling, best way I could describe it, it felt like a secondary adolescence. Like during my adolescence, I still was fairly cloistered. There was so much I wasn't allowed to do or was discouraged from doing. My parents didn't like lock me in the house or anything like that, but I just knew that I wasn't to do this, and this. Couldn't drink, smoke, or chew, nor run with those who do. That's how my mom said it. But yeah, so there were these rules, and then suddenly there were no rules, and I was interested in experimenting. What is it like to feel this way, to experience, to try these different things that I didn't get to try? So that's really what it was like. Only consequences can be pretty severe when you're doing this in your 40s and you have a credit rating that you need to protect, and certainly you have children that are watching and wondering, what the heck is going on with the parent. Um, yeah, so I think it's just like a secondary adolescence and wanting to try these things out that were missed out on. That was my experience anyway.
Yes, I would actually absolutely agree with that. And back years ago, when I was in a relationship, in a different relationship, I had gone to therapy, and that's what the therapist told my then fiance that she said, Amanda, because of her upbringing and her life and everything, like she is not emotionally the age that you would expect someone to be at her age because of the experiences she has had or not had in her life. So absolutely.
Wow. Does that answer it enough for you?
Yeah, I think so. It's something I like to talk about a little bit because the church would the Holdeman church would tend to say it's because you left the one true faith.
Right.
And
Right.
I think it's important to kind of highlight that it's actually not about faith or anything like that. It's actually about being in such a controlled environment and then being released from it.
Oh, right. And I meet people who grew up in cults that the cults themselves weren't even necessarily religious. They weren't believing in Jesus or whatever, this sort of thing, but they had such a similar experience. They were brainwashed, really, essentially. The indoctrination was so deep and so thorough. And when they leave the group, they are still struggling with a lot of the similar things that we did when we left Christianity. And we can end up with analysis paralysis. We're terrified to make a decision. We had this threat of hell looming over us for so long. Those of us who grew up with it, we can be scared to make the wrong choice. But even for folks who say grew up in Scientology, um, they didn't fear hell, but there was so much. It was such an unpleasant, unkind environment, harsh environment. Perfection was demanded, and you could be, exposed to public ridicule or what else if you didn't get it right. And there were different punishments that would be doled out within that religion as well. So, yeah, I would just encourage people to avoid religion.
And it's a little late for that.
It's a little late for us, but maybe someone else will pick up on it sooner.
Well, um, I think we've kind of gotten what we wanted. I was wondering if you wanted to once again tell people where they can get your book, the different things, social medias, everything about you.
Sure. Yes. So people can follow me on social media. I'm divorcing religion. I'm on Instagram, Threads, Facebook. They can also find me as Janice Selby because that's my real name, and then Divorcing Religion Workshop on Facebook. I'm on Blue Sky as well, and that's just as Janice Selby because someone else had already landed on my other name. My book is called Divorcing Religion, a Memoir and Survival Handbook. And my podcast is called Divorcing Religion, my YouTube channel, Divorcing Religion. And the website people can go to find out about my conference in Seattle in May is called shamelesssexuality.org. It's short for orgasm. I'm kidding. But yeah,
Yeah.
go and check it out. It's going to be a great conference. And I'm really thankful to both of you for having me on your show. This was a real pleasure.
Well, I really enjoyed it. Like I said, I really enjoyed the book. So you can get her book on Amazon. Go order it. It's like she said, she left out a lot. I'm in this, what she talked about today. She left out a lot, a lot, a lot. She was very transparent. She told the good, the bad, the ugly. And I mean, oh, did she go through some things? So absolutely get her book. I like I said, I really enjoyed it. And
Thank
then maybe we
you.
can have you back to talk about the purity culture because I know that that's one conversation we have not had on here yet that I would really like to um, delve into a little bit.
Yeah, I would really enjoy that. And if people go to my YouTube channel, they'll find former sessions from my old conferences, from the conference on religious trauma and the former shameless sexuality conference. I send people there all the time. It's such a tremendous free resource for people like us who are in recovery and also for therapists and social workers wanting to learn more about religious trauma. And I do offer a free Tuesday night support group online people recovering from religious trauma. So they can go to my divorcingreligion.com website and you look under services and there you find out more about the support group because I just want to support people.
Wonderful. Okay, well, Janice, thank you so much for coming on here with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, what a lot of fun. It was great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.